Hello and welcome, and what we're going to be looking at today in this video is we're going to be looking at superlatives. Now what are superlatives? Well, let's just start with an example. Small, smaller, smallest. Now, superlatives are basically another misused or commonly misused grammar skill. Now, they're often incorrectly used when making comparisons, and the sort of direct comparisons that often you're making when you're using superlatives. So, obviously, you've got the difference between small and smaller, which is the ER superlative basically just means that you're comparing one to be greater or lesser than the other. And then you've got smallest, which means that it's the other end, it's the other extreme. So we've got the biggest or the smallest, and whatever one applies to the other superlatives that you may be using. Now, it's the most extreme example. It's the top or the most. So basically what it does is it replaces the words more and most. But we'll go on to that in a second. Prepositions to and then are often needed to ensure that they are used correctly. So the giraffe on the right is smaller than the one in the middle, and is much smaller than the one on the far left. So the giraffe on the left is the biggest, and then you go your way down. Fairly simple when you start with, but then we're going to go a little bit more complicated. So let's start with more or less. And that's basically what a superlative is to start with. To say that these apples are fresher than those in the supermarkets is basically saying that these apples are more fresh. So, and this is something that I quite commonly pull up a lot. And when I see students use it. So when I see people like you use superlatives, quite often what happens is that they use it twice. They'll say more fresher, which is sort of weird, really. It's like saying it's more fresh. So it doesn't really make sense. So what you need to do instead is just focus on what the purpose of it is, and then just discuss it based on that. Now, you can really just come up with some very simple comparisons using it, and that's mainly what you're doing with these anyway. It's nothing too complicated. All right, let's have a look at the next bit. Biggest is best. All right, bear in mind what you're comparing. By saying one is the biggest, you're meaning that there is the extreme. You have to use it very carefully, because if you use it twice, immediately is a glaring alarm that goes off in any English teacher's head that says, why does this come out? So be careful when you use it, and it's one of those things that you just want to be really careful, and it's always something that you go over a second and third time just to make sure everything's right. You need to think ahead. So if you say he's bigger than him, you're not saying the same thing. You're saying quite simply that it means someone is the biggest, or someone else is the biggest. So you have to be really careful and think carefully about what it is you're actually trying to say by using a superlative. All right, now how do you use them well? Okay, first of all, think very carefully about who or what you are comparing. And putting everything in the correct order is rather helpful anyway. So by thinking what is the biggest, smallest, whatever, you're helping to set out your writing so it makes logical sense. So obviously your superlatives being used are going to be used correctly anyway. You would check a dictionary for exceptions, and there are exceptions to these rules. And there are times where superlatives are not quite used the same way every single time. So be very mindful of that. And think of things like correct usage. They will usually list them next to the base word. So dictionaries are a fantastic guide for you to be able to find where a superlative is and where a superlative is used differently from the common rule. All right, so have a look around and just have a look if there actually is a superlative version, or if you just have to use the word more or less in front of it, or most. Because sometimes if you use, for instance, more important, is different from saying more important to, or whatever that may be. It's a fairly poor example, I know, but when you use it and you use it commonly, then you'll start to pick up where it's used one way and where it's used the other way. Okay, when it is not good to use them. Using specific figures can help you from overusing them, and this is something that if you keep saying bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, start using some specifics, use some actual details. Especially if you're writing something scientifically. And that basically means if you're writing about a result, then you want to be using the exact numbers. And the reason why you want to be using the exact numbers is that's what you're trying to prove. That's your evidence. So instead of saying that it's bigger or smaller, use the exact details. For instance, Bob is 1.5 meters tall, while Frank is measured at 1.4 meters. Have those exact details means that you've got the results right there crystal clear, and you don't have to use a superlative to emphasize the difference between the two of them. Of course, if you're writing a story, on the other hand, then it's just much easier to say Bob was taller than Frank, and that's basically it, really. There's just making sure that you're using them correctly is the tough bit. So when you are writing and when you're having a look at things in editing, just when you write and when you're adding superlatives or even removing them if you need to, think about why it's being used and if there is a detail or a specific that could be used a little bit better to create the effect that it is that you want. Okay, so just have a think about it before you then start randomly comparing things to each other and basically overflowing your writing with these superlatives. And this is quite often what happens, particularly when younger or inexperienced writers, if we're looking at a professional point of view, will overuse them and will not use other adjectives or other descriptions to compare things to each other. But otherwise, that's about it, really. Think of that cute puppy. So next time you use it, would you use it? And would you use it correctly, which is the more important question. But otherwise, until next time, I'll see you later.